Okay, are we live? We are live, I think. Um, Bear with me. YouTube has changed up how it does this live streaming shit, and it's not very good. So I need to figure out if I'm doing this right, and I can only do that by going live. So hello. Um, we'll see if it's working, and then we'll get into it. Looks good. Let's tweet it. Oh, okay. Yeah, I can see you guys. There's a delay. Okay, right. Where are we? Here's the chat. Hello, Uncle Phobic. Thank you, Cunt Sound, for the congratulations. Got to get a name in there right at the start that is uncomfortable to say out loud. Okay. Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for the congrats on the 5,000. So, as is tradition, um, always do a celebratory stream when hit a Twitter milestone. I can't remember if I did one for 4,000. I definitely did one for 3,000. And I did one for my blog birthday, where I played Resident Evil 7 all the way through over about, I don't know, 3 days or something. Yeah, so last night hit 5,000. Not that it really matters, but I guess what I like about doing this is it's a chance to say hello and also welcome in any new audience people and be like, hey, I'm not just I don't know, I've got a face and we can chat if you want. We can hang out. But it's also, yeah, a week today, my book Egress comes out. I need to, hang on, I need to see if I can see the chat and also see the video without delay so I know what I'm doing. Does that work? Yeah, okay. So yeah, Egress, got a book, wrote it, finished it about 6 months ago, and it's finally coming out after what feels like an eternity. A week tomorrow, I'm going to be in conversation with my former lecturer and Mark's former colleague, Kojo Ashen, who I've not seen in. I think I've seen Kojo since he did the very first inaugural Mark Fisher Memorial Lecture. So I'm really excited to catch up and see him again, and I think we're going to have a really nice chat. I'm going to read a chapter of the book, or maybe a truncated version of it. Then, I'm not going to read that tonight. And then we're going to have a chat. It's already sold out, unfortunately. It is being filmed. I don't know if it will go online in its entirety at any point, but what that film is being used for is not for me to announce. Well, that footage rather. So yeah, that's kind of it. I might see where we're at in terms of people jumping in the stream. It's quite early to be streaming, but I've been plagued with a frustratingly normie sleeping pattern the past 2 weeks. I accidentally, well, not accidentally. I came off my meds for because I ran out and had to go and get a repeat prescription, like what do you call it? I had to go and sort of say, can I continue to take this medication I've been on for a long time, please? And that whole rigmarole, they have to wait 2 weeks to get the appointment, and then it's just a nightmare. Anyway, I was too busy to actually fucking organize the thing, and then basically came off my meds because I was rushing them out. And then as I've gone back on them properly, it's just like kicked me into this really normal sleeping pattern. So I'm probably going to go to bed at like 10 o'clock, which is quite bizarre, especially in this part of the internet. I feel like no one around here is on a normal sleeping pattern. Anyway, besides the point, I'm rambling. That's why we're early, so we can finish early and I can go to bed. Put briefly. Yeah, no plan otherwise. I'm just hanging out. I've got some beers in the fridge that I might kick out later. I've got my Boomer headset on because my sound card on this laptop is melting. So do tell me if you can't hear me, if it sounds like shit. Yeah. How are you, Uncle Phobic and Cunt Sound? If you're still here. I think I've got like a 1 minute delay, which doesn't make for conducive chat. Yeah, YouTube's like outsourced its sound is fine. Okay, good. Yeah, YouTube's got like an outsourced streaming thing now, so I'm having to do this through another. And basically, before when you could stream through a single browser window built into YouTube, now I've connected a separate browser window to my YouTube account, and I'm still streaming in YouTube to see the chat, whilst all the videos coming from another window. Whoever thought this was a good idea? I guess apparently if you pay a load of money, you can like have fancy text overlays and shit. But whoever thought this was a good idea is a moron. Uncle Phobic is pretty good. Good to hear. We'll have to bugger off in a bit. University Philosophy Society is on at 6. Oh, that's what's your University Philosophy Society? What are you doing tonight? That sounds like something I should be doing rather than sitting here. Again, delay. How long is this delay? Have I set a delay on? Let me see. No added delay. What a stupid system. Anyway. Yeah. So I was kind of tempted to read something from this, though I don't really know where to start. You're leading a discussion on utopia. Big topic. I'm tempted to pry more, but then, gosh, where to start? Where are you starting? Are you starting with Thomas More? Or are you doing more like contemporary utopianisms? can see the delay of these two windows. This is so annoying. God, fuck YouTube. I'm actually starting with Plato's Republic. The focus will be on philosophical utopias, so end of history and such. Thomas More will be touched on, though. That's cool. Yet to read Plato's... No, have I read Plato's Republic? Maybe a long time ago. That's great, though. I hope you have fun. Yeah, I need to check out if there's any philosophy societies around here. This delay thing makes me think Lemurian time was boring. Yeah, well, that's the... I can never remember the Burroughs... What Burroughs goes on about in his Lemurian Time was. It's like it's the wars waging in the unconscious, right? At least that's how I interpret it. It's probably way more interesting. These conscious time delays are bullshit. This is the time delays of the dystopia of conscious time over the yeah Timocracy time. I'm gonna yeah, that was what did Lemurian Time War. I haven't read that in ages, but I want to see. The Burrow story is so good. I can't remember half of what he says. I won't find it now. That's just more of me sitting in silence. And now I've got a warning on the stream's current bit rate. Right, I'm going to basically have to close everything but these two stupid windows. I hate YouTube. Congrats on the follows and development of the blogs, Goth. Thank you very much, Systemic. Appreciate that. Pest Goth. Oh, if only. Best Goth is the worst Goth. That's the vibe I'm going for. Uncle Phobic concerned asks, will you talk about Plato's Sicily project? I'm still thinking about Lemurian Time War in between delay. I had some great notes on that from a class that Robin McKay gave. Robin Mackay, I should say. It's going to kill a bit, right? But that was such a good chat. Let me see what was said. Chat amongst yourselves, if you please. I managed to get back into my old Evernote account, which I haven't used in about 2 years since my old laptop died, and this one's about to go soon too. The sound card is melted, hence the boomer headset. Unclephobic fully expects to be dragged into a weird direction by Philosophy Society. What direction are you anticipating you'll be dragged in? Okay, yeah, here's this. Kurt's gradients. Come on. Damn, all my notes are gone. That sucks. Where have they gone? Oh well, no Mazurian time war waffle for me, which is probably for the best. Feedback: eternal difference of return. Buy a new laptop every few years. Yep, it's an actual nightmare, especially when you can't afford one. That's the only reason why I've got this shit one. This laptop was a hand me down from Robin Mackay, an old ergonomic laptop. Yeah, mine that I bought. When did I buy it? Like 6 years ago, or 6 years before it died, and then it just stopped, just completely, just yeah, cut out. And now I've got like an even older MacBook, and that's like the weird catch-22. My voice glitches a bit due to the sound card, probably, but it's no problem to make out what you're saying. Just makes it sound a bit more cyberpunk. That's what we like. Okay, as long as I can still be understood. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. This is again, if you yeah, thanks for hello to you guys if you're all new to the chat. YouTube has this new way of live streaming um, that is completely counterintuitive, and it wouldn't let me do it on my phone. Apparently, my phone is also too old to function for this new shit. Fuck Apple, I guess. ThinkPad time. ThinkPads are those? Yeah, I've been looking at getting a ThinkPad. That's what I've been weighing up. But I know nothing about laptops. I hate Macs. I like them for how long lasting they are. I can't believe this laptop is like probably the oldest laptop I've ever used, and it's only giving out now, and it's already been through like a bunch of previous owners. Um, but yeah, ThinkPads. My girlfriend's dad has a ThinkPad, and he's like a mathematician. So I kind of have always I had no idea what they were. I never associated them with like big brainness. So it's not a bad selling point if you want to be a big brain. Um, Uncle Phobic's talking about any takes on Berger's normal Marxism. Uh, no. Or is this? Wait, is this in? Who's this in the chat? Oh, Unclephobic, what direction do you... Yeah, so I was asking what direction you expect to be dragged into. Probably animal rights. That seems to be the majority of our membership's obsession at the moment. Turns out society's focused on discussing topical issues tend to attract the militant vegans. Ironically, they aren't that left-wing otherwise. I find a veganism without concern for the marginalised groups bizarre. That's really interesting. Yeah, I feel like that's a case with like philosophy departments in general, right? I kind of felt like that when I went to do philosophy at Goldsmiths. I mean, philosophy, art, theory. Um, yeah, felt a big um, uh, real push for like the whole not animal rights, but like non-human relations side of things, ecological materialism sort of stuff. Um, that is just like all the really hip things at that moment. Donna Haraway, Staying with the Trouble, Mushroom at the End of the World. Mushroom at the End of the World seems like a cool book, but Donna Haraway, Staying with the Trouble is a shit book, but seems to have like defined all humanities discourse. Um, I imagine that's the sort of crowd you're getting. Um, where we go? Berger's Normal Marxism. Yeah, not that familiar. I need to catch up on. I'm showing that's Ed's blog. I need to catch up on Ed's blog. I really liked the stuff that he and Enrico were talking about the other week, and that might have been related to that, but I haven't had the time to um, keep up with it. I've been doing loads of reading recently, and all of it offline, which is quite unusual for me. Been buying far too many books. Yeah, so yep, woke eugenics people. Yep, there you go. Sol's saying you have a Microsoft Surface. Yeah, I kind of do like the look of those as well. Actually, my girlfriend's got or had one for her old job, and I like finished my book on it because I can't use this laptop that I'm on now without being plugged into the mains. Part of the other reason why it might as well not be a laptop. It's a portable desktop at this point. Yeah, I don't know. I hate that tech chat, but I need to get one as soon as I can afford one. I'm so deep in my overdraft that I can't really even entertain the thought of it right now. Um, anyway, cows are typically easy to sympathise with in abstract concepts of humans, I suppose. You only have to see one of those videos of a cow being really happy in a field to appreciate how that is absolutely true. I'm like not prepared. What's going on? I need a way of getting this up on chat up on my phone, so I can maybe even out the bitstream a bit. Dina Goff, you inspired me to one day read D.H. Lawrence. What do you think is his best work? Oh damn. Oh god, I don't know. I can say what I think is his best work at the moment. I'm still like trying to read it all. I'm reading. I'm like going. I'm weirdly doing it back to front. So I've just finished reading Lady Chatterley's Lover, which I have like fallen in love with just because it's like read that book if you want to understand what Nick Land means by machining desire. Um, the fact that that's a connection to make is what makes me love D.H. Lawrence. He is like wild. Um, I'd say start there and like just appreciate how weird it is. But you can like go anywhere. Yeah, the Rainbow was the first one that I picked up, and didn't really want to. I mean, well, I've like got. I'm going through it backwards. So I've just finished Lady Chatterley's Lover. I'm reading Apocalypse at the moment for an essay that I've been asked to write, and then I'm also reading a biography that was written about him, Life of an Outsider, which is really great. But I feel like I'm sort of doing him as like a pincer. I've been reading the works that he wrote last, and then reading about his like early life, and it's a weird like coming together. But I'm going to be writing about him in the book that I'm writing at the moment, Um, Particularly Sons and Lovers is like this weird, um, dramatized Oedipus complex thing, and then like, or at least how that's how it was sort of received at the time, and then going into like all of D.H. Lawrence's writing on psychoanalysis, I should say. He does make an appearance in Egress. I guess technically the first thing I read of his was Studies in American Literature, um, which yeah, comes up a couple of times in Egress. My favorite chapter in this book is on um, Westworld and um, outsideness and the unconsciousness raising is what it's called. Anyway, yeah, that was where I sort of unconsciously picked up the Lawrence bug. He's been in the back of my mind since writing that chapter, and now it's like embracing him fully. What's taken his poetry? Couldn't tell you it right now. Um, this is kind of the main reason for like trying to read him all, because the arguments around his work, the sort of the opinions that people have on his work are so entrenched, and entrenched, negatively entrenched. Um, it's hard to get a grasp on it as like in the contemporary moment without just throwing yourself into it. I feel like um, he was hated at the time. He seemed to be hated by most people when he died. No one cared when he died, and then he kind of became this sort of English literature darling. My mum really liked him, um, and this is kind of what's like making me really appreciate him in the moment, as I always associated D.H. Lawrence with like, um, I mean, the books that my mum liked. My mum was like a wannabe English teacher who, did she get an English degree? I don't think she got it. I don't think she went to. I can't remember what my mum did. Um, anyway, I'm writing in the next book at the moment. I've got like this. I've basically memorized in my head all the names that my mum used to like have on her bookshelf. So mum had a breakdown a few years ago. Um, and she doesn't read anymore. She used to be like an amateur poet and wrote quite like these really nice, quite like just standard um, poems, standard in the sense of like rhyming scheme. But they were like, I liked them. She was really talented. Um, uh, um, and now she doesn't do that anymore. She's not the same woman that she used to be. But I've kind of trying to reconstruct this sense of who she was through the books on her bookshelf, and all the writers that she had on her bookshelf: D.H. Lawrence, Virginia Woolf, Daphne du Maurier, the Brontes, are like painting a picture of this woman that was like interested in all the same things that I was, which was like absolutely not my sense of our relationship growing up. So it's like this weird personal thing. Anyway, what was D.H. Lawrence hate for? He was hated for a million things. This is what's so interesting about his biography. Um, excuse me. So um, he was born around Nottingham, son of a miner, and I don't think his mum had a job, but she was like, she felt like she married down. Um, her father, her husband rather, D.H. Lawrence's father, was a bit of a drunk, supposedly, and she encouraged in her children a kind of like an appreciation of culture and reading and things like that. And he just, he was down the pit every day and in the pub at night, and had just felt completely ostracized from his family. And Lawrence kind of seems to fall in between that. He couldn't really get a job after he came of age, and ended up being like a student teacher, which isn't really a thing anymore. But he was a student and like a mentor at the same time at the local college and stuff. And I think that his like basically his slipperiness between class positions, between sort of a lower middle class and a working class family, at that time in sort of the late 19th, early 20th century, um, is sort of what made him like a square peg in a round hole. Um, and yeah, his politics just kind of shifted. He's often been interpreted as having being sort of proto-fascist, um, for the way he writes about nature, and kind of being a bit of a Luddite technophobe, hating industrialization basically, and wanting man to return to a relationship with nature, which has obviously been a slippery slope for some people. Um, he married a German woman, and he moved to Cornwall. He was chased out of Cornwall because there was a conspiracy that he was a spy for the Germans, which I think was unfounded. But he was sort of monitored by the government and kicked out of Cornwall. And basically, then he just was like a nomad. He lived in New Mexico, um, and Italy, and other places. He wrote a lot about Italy. That's the book that I'm looking forward to reading next. I've got like a copy of his writings on Italy on the way. And then by the end of his life, like a lot of his writings end up sort of being, um, people have described him as living like a communist lifestyle. Um, and I think a lot of the writing that comes, he hates Bolshevism. He always keeps attacking. He attacks Bolshevism a few times in Lady Chatterley's Lover and in Apocalypse. But I feel like his writing on his there's like this thread of communism that wouldn't become popularized until like the late 20th century, long after it died. Um, which is a kind of question of what it means to what the collective means within communism, which is something that I've had an interest in reading Blanchot and Bataille, um, and that's a lot of that's also in Egress. And Lawrence seems to be like a major precursor to that way of thinking, but isn't recognized as such. Um, and his style of writing doesn't really help that. He's very flowery, and quite sort of a bit excessive and egregious in his metaphors and adverbs and all that sort of adjective, whatever. I don't know. I'm not an English language student, but all that righty stuff, he writes really hard. He's overwrites, some people think. And yeah, I don't know. Like yeah, the perceptions of him seem to like swing to extremes, from what I've read so far, anyway. Um, Love to hate it to loved to hate it, um, throughout, in like academic sense and sort of in a canonical sense. And I don't know, yeah, I just find him super interesting for that. He's like a flag bearer for a lot of the sort of outsider writing and politics that this corner of the internet is known for being interested in, I suppose. Yeah, I like him a lot, and what I like about him the most, exactly, the complexity is what makes it interesting. Yeah, but he just wrote about everything. I think that's what I also find really admirable. Um, I think what I'm interested in, there are interesting connections to be drawn out. Bataille, Lawrence and Bataille. If you know of any solid ones, I'd love to hear them. I keep thinking at the moment that I'm really surprised that Lawrence doesn't make an appearance in Literature and Evil, um, of Bataille's book, Literature and Evil. I feel like he's like a missing. I don't even know if he's referenced. I can't remember. He probably is. I don't know. Yeah, Lawrence has just become this like missing link in my brain at the moment. He's like, I'm plugging him into literally everything. He's just like, he encapsulates everything that I've been interested in over the past sort of few years. Um, Not neatly, but that's kind of what makes him even more interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I'm ranting about Lawrence now. He's totally like at the forefront of my mind at the moment. So you set me off and you won't stop me. Um, he's cool. He's coolly uncool, or uncoolly cool, one or the other. And that all comes from reading Virginia Woolf. I've been I'm just doing like a playing Frogger or something with modernists, and Lawrence is now like the weird anti-modern modernist at the other end, the end of the river. He's become my modernist Kurtz. which is a nice way to think about it. I need to write that down. Writing in real time now. This is how it happens. Anyway, yeah. Fuck this delay. I hate YouTube. Uncle Phobic was still talking about abstracting humans. That's something that I also like in Lawrence. He's got this big thing for the inhuman within the human. Yeah, I'm going to have an essay on him coming out in like April, maybe, specifically about his last book, Apocalypse, that I got asked to write for a magazine that is having an issue on apocalypse. Is like the apocalypse is like a concept, and I was like, well, I know I'm going to write about Lawrence now, so there you go, boom, in there. It's going to be a very short essay though, and I've got loads I want to pack in, so I'm not sure what form it's going to take. It's going to have to be like super condensed. Maybe I'll make it a bit more abstract, but we'll see. Yeah, I don't really know what to do. I don't know if there seems to be a few people in the chat now and watching. It's hard to tell with YouTube's stupid new system of recording these sorts of things. But I am tempted to read something from Egress as like a preview, since it's 1 week away. Thanks for swinging by, Uncle Phobic. Enjoy your evening with the Platonists and the veganists. Yeah, go easy on them. Yeah, I don't know if anyone is interested in that, or I don't know, or whatever. I have no plans this evening. I've got the flat to myself. Part of the reason that it makes sense to do this. That's not often the case. We've got anyway. I'm just rambling and going into any topic that comes to mind now. Yeah. This is why I like Twitch, because you can just play a game, and then if things take a quiet turn, you've got something to keep the viewers entertained. It'd be cool to hear some stuff from Egress. Okay. Okay. It's good. The reason that I'm interested to read something is mostly because I feel like I need to practice actually making head or tail of the thing. I think, as I said this at the beginning, that is ordering it from the UK the only way if you happen to live elsewhere in Europe? Not at all. It is available worldwide. I'm pretty sure it should be stocked in some other bookshops. I don't know if I mean, I haven't checked. I don't know what the places would be, but if you go to the usual place that you would order books from online, for wherever you are, whether that's a local bookshop or, I mean, Amazon does have it. Amazon's the baseline, I guess, but check your local bookshop too. They may well have copies. If not, here's hoping it gets translated sometime soon. Apparently there has been interest, so it may also appear in your language at some point, which would be crazy. But yeah, part of the reason for wanting to try and wrap my head around this book is that, so next week, a week tomorrow, there's the ICA in Conversation thing that me and Kojo are going to do at the ICA here in London. And I was asked if I wanted to do a reading for that. And my initial response was, fuck no, that sounds really lame. But actually, like, how else are you meant to introduce a thing. Sweden doesn't have Amazon RIP. I mean, that's probably for the best. Um, Amazon's awful, but it should be elsewhere. Yeah. Um, so anyway, yeah, I was gonna. What I'm doing next week is I'm reading a section from the afterword. I'm starting at the end. I wrote like this after the main argument of the book sort of finishes. I make this. I've got these two short addendums. One's called an afterword, a lesson, and the other is called an addendum, an egress. Um, because I just couldn't figure out how to end the thing. Precisely because it's not really endable. Um, it's I think as a reading experience, it's satisfying. Um, but the questions there's more questions for me having finished this about what Mark's work is going to do and become. And that's what the afterwards sort of says. It goes into, this is the first book about Mark Fisher, the first work of secondary criticism. But I very much doubt it's going to be the last. Highly doubt that. And so that becomes that leaves me with so many questions. So it's a difficult thing to want to jump into. Yeah, I don't know. But I would like to read something and see how that resonates. I'm still too close to the thing to be able to figure it out. I think I can just read from the beginning. I can read the some of the intro. Oh, not the intro. The intro is sort of a bit. Well, I don't know. I can read whatever you want, which is a hard question to just throw at people when no one knows what's inside it. I don't know what I'm doing. That's the short answer to this ramble. I don't know what I'm doing, and I don't know what I should do. Um, Maybe I will just read the intro. It's not very long, so I'll do that, and I'll just maybe read it through. And if you like questions come up in the chat, or if you want to like expand on any point, like at any time, just like throw them in the comments. And when I finish reading it, then maybe I'll like then there'll be like something to go off. Maybe that's a good plan. I'll start with the epigraph. Wing It, a Blue Mystery Book of Theory. Again, apologies for the delay, which probably makes this a good idea. I'll start with the epigraph, which was super important to me writing the thing, because before the months before Mark died, I was reading a lot of Bataille and a lot of Nick Land, and thinking about how Bataille and Blanchot sort of factor in. Well, yeah, it was Bataille and Nick Land, and then when Mark died, it became more of an emphasis on Blanchot and Mark himself, and how notions of community in Bataille and Blanchot like plug into each other. And so I was reading this book that I bought called it's like a collected journal thing. Not, I don't know what you call it. My brain's misfiring. Anyway, it's called The Obsessions of Georges Bataille, Community and Communication. It's a collection of essays by a load of contemporary Bataille scholars, and it's really good. I love that book. When I wrote the very first draft of this in 2017. So the book starts with a quote from that. I'll read that quote, and then we'll go into it. So this is Andrew J. Mitchell and Jason Kemp Winfrey, and they write: at the limit of discursive thought, experience tends not only towards the outside, toward death. It also tends toward contact with another, toward community. Indeed, so much that there cannot be inner experience without a community of those who live it. Inner experience requires a community of lucky beings drawn together, bound together in their excessive movement, in their fall away from themselves. This, then, is where community is located, in the chance movement of insufficiency, in the openness of my being in the openness that my being is in exceeding the requirements of homogenization, preservation, and justification, in the moment outside oneself, which falls in love, dies, laughs, cries, mourns, celebrates, suffers. And then we're in. And why that quote is important will be contextualized later on. But this is how my book, Egress, begins, with an introduction titled The Fisher Function. 14th of January 2017. Saturday. 1 week into the new semester at Goldsmiths, University of London. The library is busy as it always is. The winter sun is making the days dark early, and it has been raining heavily all week. My friends and I, all of us postgraduate students, are stationed on the second floor, each working on 2 essays simultaneously, both due on the following Tuesday. I'm trying my best to be productive and not procrastinate when my phone lights up on the desk in front of me. Taking any excuse for a 5-minute Twitter break, I pick it up and mindlessly read a push notification on my phone's lock screen, telling me that a tweet from the account @RepeaterBooks is proving popular within my social network. In memory of Mark Fisher, 1968-2017. An inspiration and a friend. Our thoughts are with his family. I'm confused. I pass my phone over the desk divide to a friend writing an essay for Mark's class. They, in turn, pass it to the friend next to them. The tension passes like a wave from one person to the next. No one knows what to say. We start to quietly panic as our minds race, exchanging concerned looks rather than words, unable to make sense of such little information, and still aware of the fact that we are in a library. I soon start receiving messages from others about the tweet, asking if I've seen it or have any further information. Everyone asks the same question, incredulously, not expecting any real answer. Is it true? At first, we assume it to be some kind of hoax or misunderstanding. We'd heard from Mark just last week. He'd sent an apologetic email to his whole class saying that he would have to cancel his first lecture of the new semester because he'd broken his arm and had to go to the doctor about it. We didn't know how he'd managed to hurt himself, but we began to wonder. Maybe it had been a bad enough break that he'd needed to have surgery on it. Perhaps there had been complications in the operating room, but it hadn't seemed all that serious. I decided to put Mark's name into Google, followed by the word dead. Cringing at the bluntness of the search function, but not knowing how else to corroborate the rumour. A former keyboardist in the band Wham, also named Mark Fisher, had died just a few weeks ago, in December 2016. Surely they meant this Mark. But Repeater Books were Mark's publisher, having just released his latest book, The Weird and the Eerie. Furthermore, Repeater was an enterprise that Mark himself had set up with colleagues from his previous venture, Zero Books. They wouldn't get this wrong, surely. We sat in silence, continuing to work between short shock bursts of disbelief. After just a few minutes, we stopped. "What am I doing?" someone said. "What's the point now?" Later that evening, our worst fears were confirmed. On Friday, 13th of January 2017, Mark Fisher had died by suicide. In the months that followed Mark's death, answering the question, "What's the point now?" became an intense collective project within and around Goldsmiths, informing a great deal of activity, including, but by no means limited to, a summer term public lecture programme organised by students and staff within the Visual Cultures Department that Mark himself had been a beloved part of. Titled The Fisher Function, the series ran for 7 weeks throughout July and August 2017. The sessions were built around a selection of lesser-known works made by Mark in various different registers, from blog posts and academic papers to musical mixes and audio essays. The series took its name from a eulogy given by Robin Mackay. I keep mispronouncing Robin's name today. The series took its name from a eulogy given by Robin Mackay at a memorial service held on Goldsmiths campus. 1 month after Mark's death, Robin would speak to Mark's impact on the world, his ability to rally people together and foster cultural movements, but also to that entity, that thing that wrote through Mark, but which he would not take credit for. Writing on his K-Punk blog, for which he was initially best known, Mark would acknowledge blogging's tendency to summon a strange double, a second self that seems both alien, yet which cannot entirely be disavowed. He also had a novel response to the question of how he managed to sustain his incredibly prolific blogger's energy. The answer is that it isn't me who's writing. To describe how he was able to write and keep writing would be to give only a technical description of how this body has been used as a meat puppet for channeling Utnall's signal. Speaking to a force outside time that was wholly other to the subject, Mark Fisher, perpetually alienated and reduced to a meal to satisfy capitalism's eternal need for sustenance. This distant relationship to his own capacity to be inspired and create was not simply an exercise in modesty or self-deprecation, but spoke explicitly to the use of his K-Punk persona as an online avatar. It created another Mark, a Mark separate to the man doing the typing, an impersonalized figure who was able to draw together movements and communities across cyberspace, far exceeding the bounds of his biological existence. It was this effective function of the Fisher entity, alongside the meat puppet, that was also now suddenly no longer with us. Robin asked those present, what is the Fisher function? How did it make itself real, and how can we continue to realize it? Many of us naturally feel a need to ensure this is a moment when the force Mark brought into our world is redoubled rather than depleted. And to do so, to continue his work on our own, we have to try to understand his life and the consequences of his death, at once horrifying and awakening, as a part of the Fisher function. And I don't simply mean the intellectual contributions that we can appreciate, extend, take forward into the future. I also mean what we need to learn in terms of looking after ourselves and each other right now. It is precisely the Fisher function that we will explore in this book, through the very experience of community that gave the term such resonance in the immediate aftermath of Mark's death, at Goldsmiths as well as much further afield. We will explore the ways in which Mark the Man and K-Punk the Utnall Signal constituted porous relations between people, and we will consider their tandem disappearance as an egress that should be collectively held open and that cannot be ignored. Our opening epigraph, speaks well to this effective understanding of community that Mark's death galvanized for so many of us. We too found ourselves bound together in our excessive movement, in our fall away from ourselves. And it was in this fall, in the exceeding of our individual experiences, that our community was, for a short time at least, located. However, this location was not locatable. Although birthed for many from within Goldsmiths, it was not institutional. It grew implicitly beyond Goldsmiths, beyond ourselves. It was a community formed by the molten intensities of a shared experience that nonetheless could not be shared. The works of Georges Bataille are central here, and it is from a book on Bataille that this book's first epigraph is taken. Throughout his life, Bataille would repeatedly explore the frictions and tensions that moved and amorphously structured our communal relations and their limits. Limits that Bataille not only wrote about, but actively pursued and experienced. Born in France in 1897 and initially drawn to a life in the Catholic priesthood, Bataille is today most famous as a pseudonymous writer of pornographic texts, who, like the Marquis de Sade before him, explored the carnal particulars of human desire and its relationship to a base materialism, that lurks beneath our considerations of both our bodily functions and our global politics. Bataille's was an all too literal body and bodily politic in this sense, the political instability of his lifetime being considered analogous to the innate instability of subjectivity that had long haunted the entangled histories of philosophy and politics, and which had been exacerbated only a few decades previously by the birth of psychoanalysis. He considered the eternal war that structures all of human existence, a war between ways of being, between the illusionary consistency of the I and of the I of ourselves, and the often ugly nature of a body's perpetual degradation and change. The ways in which we contend with this entropic downward spiral into dissolution as we struggle to make sense of it, ourselves and each other. Bataille extended these observations to both impossible heights and impossible depths, writing on countless encounters, both personal and historical, virtual and actual, wherein humanity had found itself at the very limits of what it was able to process and understand. His obsession with so-called limit experiences would lead him to write on everything from the anatomy of the human foot to the 15th century serial child murderer Gilles de Rais, and beyond to the cosmic nihilism of Aztec sun worship and human sacrifice. He was also a diarist, and the journals he kept during the Nazi occupation of France would bring all of his philosophical and literary excursions crashing down into an imminent and abject reality of global and local suffering. Whilst the life of Georges Bataille may seem some distance from the work of Mark Fisher, in subject matter most explicitly, Mark also wrote on limit experiences throughout his life, and most explicitly towards its end. For instance, in his final unfinished essay, An Introduction to what was likely to have been his next book, Acid Communism, Mark considers the impact of LSD on the French philosopher Michel Foucault, when he embarked on a fateful trip to California's Death Valley in the 1970s, writing that for Foucault, the limit experience was paradoxical. It was an experience at and beyond the limits of ordinary experience, an experience of what cannot ordinarily be experienced at all. Marx saw Foucault's experimentation with psychedelics as an exploration of those conditions which made ordinary experience possible, but which, through psychedelic practices, could now be encountered, transformed, and escaped, at least temporarily. While Foucault may have found limit experiences most readily available through the use of psychedelics, for Bataille, our encounters with such experiences, no matter how base or seemingly transcendental, are inherent to all of human existence. He would go so far as to define being itself to the unshareable nature of inner experience, that experience which responds to the necessity of which I exist, and our human capacity to challenge (question) everything without acceptable rest. That experience which is questioning (testing) in fever and anguish what man knows of the facts of being. This, for Bataille, is the driving force behind all of philosophy, but also poetry and literature, and indeed life itself. It is, perhaps unavoidably, a violence. It is the true nature of a life lived through the very questioning of its own foundations, both historical and contemporaneous. This mode of thought may already be familiar to us. It resembles the abyssal questioning that many find at the heart of that mid-20th century philosophical phenomenon, existentialism. Bataille, however, had no interest in the Sartrean nausea of a parochial and individualized thought that had come to define that particular movement for him. Indeed, Bataille's 1943 book, Inner Experience, would receive a damning appraisal from the existentialist-in-chief, Jean-Paul Sartre himself, in a review written for the journal Le Cahier du Sud, in which Sartre admonished Bataille with his tone of spiritual superiority, denouncing him as a mystic who has seen God and rejects the all-too-human language of those who have not. Bataille later responded to Sartre's brutally negative review by agreeing with many of his criticisms and findings, recognizing that they offered up an opportunity for critical communication, the very motor of the inner experience he had attempted to write about. It was precisely through his rebuttal to Sartre that Bataille would level his own challenge to existentialism's inherent individualism. Bataille, in explicit contrast to Sartre, was interested in communal relations above all else. Not as a hellish necessity for an otherwise isolated individual, but rather as the driving force of a civilization that must always embrace its own multiplicity, especially and despite those moments when such an exercise feels like it might tear up the very foundations upon which we base our understanding of ourselves. Whereas Sartre infamously wrote that hell is other people, Bataille instead reframed communication as a psychedelic intoxication in which the self can reach its outside and be all the better for it. In his play No Exit, from which that oft-quoted line is taken, Sartre depicts hell as being devoid of red-hot pokers, instead consisting of little more than 3 people in a drawing room who are locked in a communicative deadlock. The horror of this secular hell for Sartre is defined by the paradox of an individual misanthropy, which nonetheless knows that to isolate oneself completely from the other is to lose oneself completely. How can we truly know ourselves at all without the opportunity of seeing ourselves reflected in the eyes of another? Hell is other people, yes, perhaps, but it seems that abject isolation is worse even than that. Hell is the inescapability of other people. Bataille's view of humanity was not so different, although he rejected Sartre's stern melodrama. Bataille's vision of the world was far more Dantean, choosing to supersede all Christian dogma, controversially affirming the absurdity of our situation and inserting a perverse laughter back into the divine comedy of human existence. For example, later mocking Sartre's misanthropy in his work on Nietzsche, Bataille dramatizes their disagreement, as Sartre may have done himself, all too seriously, through a strange and humorous scene in which the two are seen dancing face to face in a potlatch of absurdity, the philosopher, Sartre, and me. Here, the very disagreement occasioned by Sartre's review, in which he deems Bataille to be a woefully insufficient thinker on the nature of human experience, was a perfectly perverse demonstration of Bataille's attempts to take a scalpel to his own thinking. He notes that Sartre himself demonstrates how the presence of another is necessary to any attempt to actualize one's chosen, self-abolishing activity. He writes with a masochistic admiration of Sartre's ability to describe the movement of my mind, based on my book, emphasizing its foolishness from the outside, better than I could from within, folding Sartre's own observations back into their encounter. He adds, in telling and still mocking parentheses, I was moved. Evidently inspired by Sartre's denunciation, Bataille would later write that being is constituted by a principle of insufficiency, referring to the foundational characteristic not just of inner experience, but of all human communication and conflict, whereby the sufficiency of each being is endlessly contested by every other. This is to say that for Bataille, to be is to be entangled in the questioning of one's own and another's being. And it is here that community finds and fails it. That's on a roll. And it is here that community both finds and fails itself in its folded alterity. I need a drink of water now. In light of this conceptualization of communal relation, itself innately insufficient, Bataille's friend and fellow philosopher Maurice Blanchot would later ask, what then calls me into question most radically? Writing posthumously on Bataille's legacy, debating whilst also enacting the communal thinking at its heart, Blanchot was posing this question rhetorically, but also perhaps with one particular individual in mind, the philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy, who had likewise chosen to re-evaluate Bataille's works in the aftermath of his death, but who was unconvinced by his amorphous evocations of a transgressive collective subject. Blanchot argued otherwise. Answering his own question, he writes that what calls an individual into question most radically is their experience of death, and a particular kind of death at that, It is not, he writes, my relation to myself as finite, or as the consciousness of being before death or for death, but rather my presence for another who absents himself by dying, that calls me into question most radically. This is to say that, for Blanchot, it is generally only through the rupture of a community that we are able to intimate the existence of a community at all. It is only through our presence for someone who is absent that we can truly understand the implications of our communal relations. As Blanchot continues, to remain present in the proximity of another who by dying removes himself definitively, to take upon myself another's death as the only death that concerns me, this is what puts me beside myself. This is the only separation that can open me, and its very impossibility, to the openness of a community. To engage with this openness, this opening, is perhaps to egress, a word used by Mark in his final book, The Weird and the Eerie, to describe the latent acts of exit that were central to the weird fictions he wrote about so passionately and so frequently. Mark begins by noting how the weird is an important cultural and aesthetic form for the ways in which it denaturalizes all worlds by exploring their instability, their openness to the outside. The outside here refers to a mode of radical exteriority, philosophically understood as that which is fundamentally beyond the scope of human perception, experience, and intuition. We will explore this concept in more depth in a later chapter, but for now, we shall only emphasize the ways in which the weird, and its probing of the innate instability of subjectivity, as well as that of the world around us, has a tendency to uncover our blind spots and our unknowns, as well as alternative configurations of those things which we may not know are in fact changeable. Isolated within the context of Mark's final published work, the political implications of the concepts of egress, the weird, and the eerie are not made as explicit as one might expect. This is perhaps because Mark himself was in the habit of routinely calling himself into question, for better and for worse, and the weird and the eerie was something of a break from all that had come before it, a work of cultural criticism that chose to distance aesthetics from any explicit reference to our contemporary politics. Considered beyond its own bounds, however, we can see Mark's conception of the weird as being as much a part of the quotidian mundanity of life under capitalism as it was a part of the fictions that he read and wrote about for his final book. Indeed, the book routinely falls back on the weirdness of the everyday, containing subtle echoes and acknowledgements of his various and generic daily experiences, of teaching and learning, of falling in love, of doing his taxes. By taking the aesthetics out of his politics, and considering said aesthetics on their own merits, the weirdness of our political realities only becomes more pronounced through their difference from the fictions we deploy to make sense of them. This was, in essence, the last hurrah of Mark's cold rationalist mode, a current within his thought that was as openly indebted to the 17th century rationalism. Let me start that again. With some water. This was, in essence, the last hurrah of Mark's cold rationalist mode. YouTube's breaking on me now. Come on, let me see if it'll fix itself. What's happened? I'll continue. Let me know if it's not working. There will be a delay. We're close to the end of the intro. I promise. This was, in essence, the last hurrah of Mark's cold rationalist mode, a current within his thought that was as openly indebted to the 17th century rationalism of Baruch Spinoza as it was the totally wired politics of Fall frontman Mark E. Smith. For Fisher, freedom and ethics do not come from our capacity to simply do whatever we please, but rather from our capacity to understand how and why we do them. Although the experiences explored in weird fiction may be anything but rationalist in this sense, Marx's attraction to the strange in fiction more broadly came from its dramatic interrogations of our own realities. Things are not what they seem. This is as true of haunted houses as it is of life under capitalism. Marx's response was to implore us to ask ourselves, who or what is it that cannot or will not explain what it is doing or why it is doing it? Who or what has something to hide? Who or what has the most to gain by doing so? Here, Marx's conceptualizations of the weird and the eerie, within the wider context of his writings, begin to resemble ontological, as opposed to aesthetic, tools for the creation of passageways to the outside. These could be, for instance, passageways between capitalism and its suppressed socioeconomic alternatives. But Marx would also extend the physical act of egress to include the cognitive and speculative exits that are already available to us in our daily lives. He emphasized this repeatedly on his K-Punk blog by championing Spinoza's particular brand of psychedelic reason, the ways in which the Dutch philosopher tells you not to get out of your head through the use of drugs, for instance, which, useful in some circumstances, dissolve the ego all too temporarily, but rather how to get out through your head, dismantling the foreign installation of the superego that lies within. This may require some great effort on our part, but not necessarily under the auspices of governmental infrastructures, much less the intrusions of psychotherapy. This rational dismantling was radical and psychedelic as far as Marx was concerned, because human beings come fully equipped with all that they need to enact it. This is to say that the weird can be found simply by paying closer attention to the ways of the world around you. Seeing the world as it already is, can take you to far stranger places than any hallucinogen, in part echoing Mark E. Smith's message on the Falls 1980 single Totally Wired. You don't have to be weird to be weird. Marx's final and unfinished writings constitute the further development of this thought in this regard, speaking specifically to the egresses that might be made possible by an acid communism. We will explore this provocative neologism in more detail later. For now, we will restrict ourselves to highlighting its immediate relevance to our Blanchottian conceptions of communication and community. Blanchot's previously referenced writings on community later referred specifically to the problem of communism as it appeared within the popular imagination in the late 20th century. In his 1984 book, The Unavowable Community, for instance, Blanchot writes of communism as a possibility that is always already caught up within its own impossibility. It speaks not to the spectre of communism, as it has so often been named since its famous conjuration by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto, but also to community itself as a particular problematic of the human condition. For Blanchot, since the idea of communism, and community more broadly, continues to haunt Europe and the world at large, it must be considered not only as a political question, but as an ontological one also. For Blanchot, in this sense, community becomes the desirable essence at the heart of any communist project, which nonetheless remains shrouded in the shadows of its historical failures. He recognized that many of the left's contemporary political projects remain indebted to a communistic sense of solidarity with our fellow human beings, despite communism's supposedly dwindling relevance to contemporary politics, a political reputation that has, at least until very recently, been wholly derisory. Whilst the political left's enemies may dismiss this loyalty to a communist project as symptomatic of a trademark naivety and stubbornness, for Blanchot, did I read that right? Whilst the political left's enemies may dismiss this loyalty to a communist project as symptomatic of a trademark naivety and stubbornness, for Blanchot, the survival of the communality of communism suggests that the desirability of a new collective subject, contrary to the mandatory individualism of capitalism, could not be exercised as easily as the failure of communism, as a paradoxically state-driven project seemed to suggest. However, such a vision was not rose-tinted and utopian. Instead, Blanchot would persistently wonder how any true version of communism could ever be possible if, as Bataille suggested, human communication and collectivity is grounded by a principle of insufficiency. In response to this, he would sketch a newly para-ontological orientation towards communism, excavating from the reality of its squandered existence in the popular imagination the subjective ideals that constitute our very understanding of its historical desirability. In this way, Blanchot was seeking to develop his project beyond communism's historical totalitarianisms, a beyondness that philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy later summarized as serving the constitution of a community that is not given, particularly by the rigid and bureaucratic infrastructures of the capitalist state, but that gives itself as a goal. As a result, in attempting to rethink communism in the late 20th century, Blanchot found himself coming back full circle, back to questions of community and communication that were, to invoke the spirit of another philosopher, Jacques Derrida, haunted by their very multiplicities and immanent to the other. Revenant questions that will always return. We're getting there. I forgot how long this was. And I wrote the thing. That's why I'm reading a very short chapter next week at the ICA. Considering Blanchot's strangely hopeful communities that are founded on grief and historical failure, the questions at the heart of the Fisher function are worth reiterating here. What are the consequences of Marx's death on his own thought and writings? What is the role of his death, in the formulation of a post-capitalist community, acid communist or otherwise? What are the revenant questions that his death brings back to the fore of our politics and collective imaginations? Most immediately, the surreality of death as it is experienced by those that remain alive injects a strangeness deep into the heart of our communities. Through its weirdness, the abject reality of death clarifies the stakes of our politics like nothing else, and likewise ruptures the strange behaviours we take for granted in this world of ours. Any attempt at writing about the works of Mark Fisher at this point in time must contend with these problematics, and this book repeatedly and explicitly attempts to do so. Beginning its existence as a master's dissertation, or rather as one student's attempt to carry on learning from a man who was traumatically no longer around to teach, I found Marx's death enacting many of the instances of egress that he wrote about. However, at no point does this book wish to suggest that Marx's suicide was in any sense an act of protest. As many of Marx's friends have made clear, in the end Marx's mental health was not a political issue, but tragically personal. Nor is it the intention of this book to use Marx's death as a convenient anecdotal entry point into a purely philosophical and para-academic project. Nevertheless, we cannot ignore the fact that the news of Marx's death led to various communal revolts within familiar modes of interpersonal relation, where, my voice is going. Nevertheless, we cannot ignore the fact that the news of Marx's death led to various communal revolts wherein familiar modes of interpersonal relation became insufficient and had to be re-evaluated. In this way, Marx's suicide presented an opportunity for egress only to those of us left behind, in being an event that occasioned an emotional exit from present circumstances, giving birth to communal praxis of care and intensifying a newfound desire for political change across various scales and locations. At Goldsmiths in particular, we found ourselves acting in new ways in each other's company. Through the grief and despair, we found ourselves questioning the surreality of our previous modes of existence, asking of ourselves, what if we always treated each other like this? And more importantly, why have we not acted in this way before? We should also note here, before we continue, that this book is a paradoxically singular product of this very process of ontopolitical questioning, at once private and depressive, collective and joyful. It is as much a product of the processes of grief and depression, mourning and melancholy, as this is about these subjects. At worst, you might describe it as one long and protracted coping mechanism, an exercise of confidence in the face of hopelessness, due to its no, full stop. Due to its, at times, self-centered nature, the process of writing this text has occasionally provoked anger and suspicion, as my own sufficiency has been questioned by those around me, and particularly by those who felt they knew Mark a lot better than I did. This is something to be expected. As such, I cannot say if, and in fact I very much doubt, that these pages speak to the experiences of anybody else who was close to the situations and circumstances it describes. An innate awareness of this situation only necessitates further the act of speaking for myself. However, it is my hope that what was begun as a personal process undertaken in the midst of a communal trauma may nevertheless, through the dislocating act of writing it all down, allow these experiences to unfold outwards and take on life beyond the communities within which this book was initially produced. Excuse me. Furthermore, it is also my hope that the resonances acquired by the texts explored herein, in the orbit of Fisher's own writings and references, might also be continuously sustained, their vibrations travelling far beyond the pages of this book into the hearts and minds of others. It is precisely this contagious, affective, and transductive resonance that remains the beating heart of the Fisher function, as it was indeed the beating heart of all of Mark's writings. In light of these experiences, it is from within the ungrounding, the egress of Mark's death, that this book must still necessarily begin. This is because there is no recovering from the force of reading a life and its works under the weight of such extreme circumstances. But through our explicit consideration of the event of Mark's death, it is my belief that the ethical and political stakes of his writings, and the writings of others, can reveal themselves to us again more clearly. Throughout this difficult process, Mark's death may at times become distressingly impersonal, as an event sometimes held necessarily at a distance. But we must remember that Mark himself believed that forms of depression are best understood and best combated through frames that are impersonal and political rather than individual and psychological. It is likewise my belief that through a sensitive consideration of the political implications of Mark's death, we may find that the new and intensified praxis of communality and care that so often erupt from within grieving communities can spread and affect change further afield. By asking these difficult questions of ourselves, honestly and openly, we may find hope, and not just hope, but confidence. As Mark wrote on his K-Punk blog in May 2015, we don't need hope. What we need is confidence and the capacity to act. To write in service of this act is not to weigh down themes of collectivity and communication with a tone of self-righteousness or piety. The Fisher function is not a call to liturgy. Regardless of how much Mark's writings were imbued with a certain spiritual agnosticism. It is instead an attempt to grapple with difficult questions through grief, which, in their being abjectly unshareable, rupture the very function of the first-person narrative so often deployed on the following pages. This is to say that Egress is a book that wants to be kind, and, if at all possible, gentle. However, it also wants to rip down the eye that litters its pages, dissolving itself through the externalization of its own narrative's affects. This narrative dissolution is embraced because so much of the book was written in the midst of a moment when the world felt utterly broken, and it was first intended to be nothing more than a personal and semi-private attempt to climb out of such a circumstance. It was an attempt to rebuild a world and a thought that seemed to fail in the moment of Mark's death, its own creator. And what thought can recover from an event such as that? We will attempt to strive for a new and currently underdefined Fisher function, precisely because it is new. With the very process of its instantiation being so resolutely different to the actualities of a present moment that its description might just rest us from our socio-political complacencies. In these moments, this book's language may take on an energy of delirium, but we shall attempt to deploy the cold rationalism of grief in order to escape its bounds. This delirium in itself, however, can be useful to us. As Blanchot would describe it, it is a delirium that emerges from the immensity of the effort that must be made, the necessity of again putting into question all of the values to which we are attached, of returning to a new barbarity in order to break with the polite and camouflaged barbarity that serves as our civilization, the unknown toward which we direct ourselves, for we absolutely do not know what man could be, the terrible violence that the inequality in the satisfaction of needs provokes, the enslavement to things, the governance of things, as well as the dialectic proper to technology, the inertia, finally, the fatigue. It is the river of capitalist capture, and it is weird. For Blanchot, as for Mark, as for so many of us, to recognize the potential of this thought alone is intoxicating. The first chapter in this book, Into the Weird, will consider Mark's philosophical trajectory and the affects of the Fisher function, alongside the problematic of left melancholy, as described by Wendy Brown, a problematic Mark understood to be a central condition of capitalist realism. We will also ask what political agencies can be drawn from the entangled experiences of death and loss in the context of Marx's association with the projects of accelerationism and Prometheanism, drawing on the writings of Marx's many friends, associates, and influences, as well as engaging with a broader history of the relationship between the politics of mental health and post-capitalism, both of which Mark wrote about at length. Chapter 2, Reaching Out Beyond to the Other, will consider the prevalence of fraught battalion communities within the works of weird fiction that Mark loved so much, particularly the writings of H.P. Lovecraft, M.R. James, and Joan Lindsay. Furthermore, the racialized insufficiency with which Lovecraft in particular littered his weird tales will provide us with an opportunity to consider the legacy of Mark's controversial former lecturer and fellow member of the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, Nick Land, as well as the impact of Land's writings on Mark's attempts to wrestle with the human and inhuman dynamics of our various political movements. The following chapter, Mental Health Asteroids, will relate these issues to contemporary film and television, and particularly to how visual media are expanding our capacity to think the climate crisis and the impending possibility of our own extinction. Two concerns that have been gathering momentum in recent years, and which have emerged as the central political concerns of our time. The climate crisis is also a political issue that requires a new kind of collective politics, and we shall see how the philosophies of community can be extended into this recently reinvigorated movement as well. Chapter 4, Unconsciousness Raising, will explore the more immediate implications of discourses of community and death, as they resonate with the lived depressions that so many are struggling with in our present moment, with particular attention paid to the various political struggles in the USA that have erupted onto the world stage since the election of President Donald Trump, all of which will be read through representations of America's own history, particularly the anachronism of the television series Westworld. Chapter 5, Friends, Communities and Ghosts, will ruminate in more detail on the lived experiences of friendship that have been encountered over the 3 years since Mark's death, as well as suggesting that music may provide the best foundation for a functionally weird communist politics. This chapter also contains an in-depth philosophical exploration of the concept of friendship in the works of Gilles Deleuze and Friedrich Nietzsche, before turning to Marx's conceptualization of an acid communism. Chapter 6 will explore the ideas that have become most readily associated with acid, spreading throughout the political left with a perhaps surprising virality given Marx's essay's unfinished nature, turning to its antecedents in the dance music cultures that have previously made use of the word acid so extensively. Chapter 7, and afterward a lesson, will serve as a final return to the rupture as it was experienced within Goldsmiths, University of London, providing us with an opportunity to affirm the strangeness of teaching that meant so much to Mark's work, and the ways in which politics have routinely undermined our educational institutions in recent years, both for better and for worse. Finally, there is a short addendum, a final egress, which takes a moment to ask before this book ends what we should do with the questions in this book that inevitably remain unanswered. The underlying question here is one of grief, of communal grief that finds itself everywhere in popular culture, externalized and represented in the most surprising of places, and of how unfinished thoughts function not only as a coping mechanism for dealing with interpersonal and intellectual loss, but also as a platform on which to build new futures. In light of this, we will consider the narratives of TV shows like The Walking Dead, The OA, and Westworld, as well as the music of The Caretaker and Aphex Twin, each with their focus on a different kind of personal and political egress. Whilst our visual media so often render these questions through fantasies of transcendence, our music is far more imminent, and we will later consider this fissure between the two. Mark's death still remains unthinkable in the face of all these considerations that are to follow, but a turn towards speculative narratives and pop cultural experimentation nonetheless feels productive. It is likewise a way of deploying the fissure function in a manner indebted to Mark's own approach to cultural criticism. In particular, these televisual narratives have the potential to radically externalize the stakes of thinking the unthinkable by making it impersonal, a thinking that Mark's own writing now, for us, in the aftermath of his suicide, simultaneously enact and undo. By considering all of the above within the context of the fissure function most explicitly, this book hopes to demonstrate how depressive and mournful thought can nonetheless fuel hope, confidence, and praxis within communities that form around the affects of death, grief, and mental illness. But first, we must begin with the moment wherein these affects first revealed themselves to so many. And then we go in down the rabbit hole. That was quite long, and that's why I'm not reading the introduction next week at the ICA. We'll be here all night. Oh my god, my throat has died. Is anyone still here? We lost half people in the... It's better if you read it for yourself rather than me reading it. Yeah. Just wait for the delay now. Have a breather. Did that take me like an hour to read? I'm really sorry. Oh dear. I should actually, of course, there was some questions in the chat. Let me. What's Sol saying? Thanks for. I have a good reading voice. Thank you. That's very nice of you to say. A great transition from the pure concreteness of the event of the death to the theoretical understanding of it, reflecting how you scramble to understand to get out of what you are thrown into. Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it, and that's basically what the book is. I think it's kind of that's, and also why I find it so weird to have it out now in, out in a week's time, in public. It's a very personal scrambling, and the amount of theory in it probably dulls that. In necessarily dulls it anyway, not in a negative sense, but dulls it for me. So it's I was reading some Frederick Jameson last week and really liked this thing that he said in the modernist papers, talking about I think he's talking about D.H. Lawrence actually, and a few other people. um, and he says something like what the modernists all shared was an attempt to distance themselves from their own emotions, so or from their own psychologies, that feelings and emotions become objects, become art objects in a sense, become things that you can uh, walk around and look at from outside of yourself. Um, and that's what this book has done for me. I wouldn't say it's like a modernist thing. Maybe it is. I don't know. That would be kind of cool to think about. I'll let everyone else decide that, but that's certainly the intent, and I think you've captured that really nicely there. And I'm skipping ahead, but no apologies at all for taking up so much space. I appreciate the responses. Death as the openness, etc. Interesting, echoing back to the ancient Greek philosophy being considered by others contemporary to it as a death cult. Don't remember where I read about this from though. Um, that's interesting. Uh, the Greeks aren't my strong point, but that sounds. I'm sure that there's Rez has got some essays, even on like Etruscan thinking. Um, yeah, of like a death cultishness in early philosophy. Also, music as escape, but rejecting transcendence immediately brings Mount Erie's A Crow album to mind. Do you mention it if in any relation to those others you mentioned, such as The Caretaker? Um, that is an amazingly prescient connection you've made. Mount Erie is a subject in one of the later chapters. Towards the end of the book, yeah, I talk about A Crow Looked at Me quite a bit. Because yeah, that album came out in 2017, um, and was hugely important to me. I've always loved Phil Elverum stuff. I actually emailed Phil Elverum a copy of this book to ask if he'd write a blurb for it on the cover, and he didn't have the time. And I think that'd probably be a bit of a weird thing for him to do anyway. Um, but he said he remembered my name from placing a lot of mail orders from Phil Elverum and Son when I was a teenager, which was actually really nice to hear from him about that. Um, yeah, I've loved his work for a long, long time. Precisely for the way that he manages to. Um, he is like a romantic, not modernist to me in the 21st century. Um, had so much interest in the outsideness of nature as a sort of like a German idealism for like a. It's like he's like if Kurt Cobain read Schelling. I feel like that's who he is to me. And he's a huge inspiration. So yeah, he's definitely in there, and not just that album, but also there's a short right when I was finishing the book, because the book I was adding to the book right up to the limit. Towards the end, it really does get it's diaristic throughout, but at the end, it really did start to feel like a diary because I was I was writing entries and making comments um, right up to uh, the last entry is 8th of August 2019, um, which I wrote about a week after seeing Mount Erie play here in London, um, and all of Phil's new stuff, which uh, not so much on this new like collaborative album that he had out. I don't know if he's going to release them. I hope he does. The songs he played at that gig were amazing, but sort of showed a further step of removal. First, it was the egress of his wife's death, opening up a new world to him, and then when he got married again, and sort of not got over his grief, but life kept moving, and there's a further egress, an egress back into the banality of everyday life, and all of his songs sort of his new songs take on a concern with that, and that blew my mind. So yeah, he's totally in there. You were surprised to see that Mark never mentioned any Phil related projects at K Punk. Maybe it's a bit too far from what you usually listen to, though. Yeah, maybe. It might not have been, I don't know. Um, yeah, Mount Erie microphone stuff sort of was like, felt like a very particular moment. like with the Glow Part 2 sort of being a weird, like, I don't know. It's like I think that's what I love most about his songs. And there's a line in one of his more recent, or not more recent songs. It's going to show my age now, but I remember when Clear Moon came out, and there's that. I think it's the first song, Through the Trees Part 2, and there's that line where he sings about mountains and websites, um, and that's like that sort of weird. It's the cyber gothic essentially. It's like a cyber gothic current through his music. Um, that was there as soon as he sort of became famous, right? Like the Glow Part 2 was already a sort of idolized by the likes of Pitchfork and stuff. It was like he was like a sort of he felt like he was like neutral. Microphones were like Neutral Milk Hotel, right? They were like the super underground band that everybody seemed to know, in like a really weird paradox. And all of his music was amazing because it dealt with those paradoxes like explicitly in the writing. I always loved that. Um, but that's a very sort of different. That resonated more with me as a kid growing up in the 2000s and being like um, somewhat like removed from the the velocity of that moment, which I assume that Mark at that moment was totally embedded into. Was it like the Glow Part 2 came out in like 2004, and that's key post CCRU era. So I imagine that the Mark of that moment might not have been into the microphones at all. Might have just found it like totally, um, yeah, um, not conducive to where he was at, and I think that totally makes sense. But who knows? Um, didn't the song "Belief" on the collab album emerge? On the collab album, engage with the more Egress thing a bit, with the Let's Get Out of the Romance back. Yes, yeah, right, exactly that callback. Yeah, so that was one of the songs he sang when I saw him last year, and I found that that really moved me. I wrote up about it somewhere. I think the post's called "Views from Earth" on Xenogothic blog, and I kind of wrote a bit about my relationship to Phil's music on there. I might post it in the chat actually, um, because that's what I found that really weird. Not weird, but like moving to see that he went back to singers in that period. Um, As actually, I've got a prop to show. One sec. Hopefully, you can still hear me. This microphone connection is shit. I'll put this in the chat. This will probably seem like totally out of context until the delay catches up. That's weird. He tagged me in my own thing. Anyway, I went back to my parents' house and picked up the original. I don't know if this is even still available, but it was like a Dawn. Um, the It's a collection of all the songs that Phil wrote when Mount Erie was born. It's like a project in like his little when he had his Walden moment, and he wrote all of these songs in a cabin in Norway. And it's like his journal from that time, and it's so good. This is my I poured over this. Always loved that sense of like diaristic philosophizing. I love that project so much. Oh, great, cool. Yeah. But yeah, that I guess what you're saying with the Let's Get Out of the Romance Egress callback is totally true. I mean, that's what I feel like. That's what his project's always been about, right? It's that Twin Peaks sense of Egress, the porosity between worlds. He he lives on that line. He's got like one side of him's online, the other side's off, or something like that. Though he's not that present on social media, which is weird, but Um, yeah, totally. God, yeah. You set me off now. I love him to bits. Love all of his stuff. Um, never, yeah, never said hi to him. I bought when I saw him last year. I've seen him a couple of times. I saw him in Cardiff um, when Clear Moon came out, and maybe a couple of years before that at an ATP festival, and then yeah, last year. And I bought whatever the sequel to Now Only. I bought that from him in person, and felt really weird about doing it. And yeah, I think like it felt. I feel like maybe I don't know. It was a really weird encounter. I felt like he looked deep into my soul and was like, I feel like I know you want to say things, and please don't. I'm trying to chill here. It was like a weird moment. Cool guy though, very cool guy. Yeah, well done for picking up on that for sure. Um, oh, cool. He was still selling. That's great. I'm glad that there's still copies because it was. I was looking when I was reading it the other day. Um, Fall 2008. Shit, so long ago. First edition. It shows I'm showing my age. God, that makes me feel so old. Fall 2008. It's over 10 years ago. That's really fucked up. Anyway, yeah, the fact it was like a what was it? Buenaventura Press, Oakland, California. I didn't expect it to be the sort of project they do reissues of. So it's cool that he's still got it going around. It's such a nice. I think it's like I don't know. It's just like the perfect way to present that album, um, and just demonstrates that continuum between what he's become very well known for doing now, and how that's always sort of been there in his writing. Anyway, I really had nothing to say to Phil when I brought much from him. I'm embarrassed myself too many times to artists. Yeah, I know that feeling. Um, yeah, I've had some really good ones. I think like I've met everyone that I've ever wanted to meet, but I met them all when I was very very young. Not very very young, but like when I was like 20, I was going to lots of festivals, and I knew a few music photographers who were like quite chummy with artists, and like would like I remember having a joint at a festival and like chatting for a few minutes with uh, Alan and Mimi from Low, who were like staying in the chalet next door to where this like guy we were chatting to was this friend of ours was staying. That was really surreal, and yeah, so I felt like I met all my heroes at the age of 20, and was very humbled by the fact they were all just human beings. Um, but was like also very aware. I'm also very aware of the fact now um, that I'll probably make a cringe. Anyway, I'm ranting. Thank you very much, Sol, for all of your questions and responses. Um, uh, and yeah, thanks for hanging around. I may also call it a night, unless anyone else has got any questions for who's here in the chat. That was quite a long reading session, but I will post it as like a preview. So if people want to check out the introduction to Egress, I've just read it to you. Um, and hopefully that's not too much of an intensive launch pad for the rest of the thing. I've been initial feedback has been that it flows really nicely. I hope you'll think the same thing. But yeah, thanks a lot, Sol. Sorry, I hope I'm saying that right too. And I hope you managed to find a copy near you. Yeah, I'll let the delay catch up. Maybe that'll be yeah. Call it a night. Enough of my reading and nervous rambling. for a stream that seems to have broken for me anyway. YouTube's fucked itself with this new setup. Yeah. Okay. I'll call it a night. The delay is driving me crazy. But I hope that was enjoyable for the few of you stuck around. And I hope if you're watching this later, um, it piques your interest. Egress on Morning Melancholy and Mark Fisher is out next week in all good bookshops. It's published by Repeater Books. You can buy it direct from their website. I think there'll also be an ebook version. And next Wednesday, the book launch is at the ICA, Institute of Contemporary Art in London. I'm going to be in conversation with Kojo Eshin. We'll have like an hour chat and like a half-hour Q&A, and I'll be doing another reading. I'm going to read a very, very short chapter right at the end of the book that just contextualizes it going forwards. Not so much why it was, contextualized, not so much why it was written, but what I hope and wonder it might do now that it's out of the world. And that'll be a jumping off point for me and him. So yeah, a bit of a weirder one tonight. Thank you for your continued support and interest and all that shit. And maybe I'll when I get to 6,000 followers, maybe I'll just go back to streaming Minecraft. All right. Thanks again. Bye. Bye.